Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. As the war in Ukraine approaches its fourth year, international efforts to secure a peace agreement are intensifying. The United States has proposed a new format for talks, with recent meetings in Florida involving Russian and American envoys, and possible participation from European representatives. Meanwhile, France has welcomed Russia's apparent openness to discuss the conflict with President Emmanuel Macron, signalling a potential diplomatic avenue. Joining us to explore this complex dynamic is Michael MacKay, former lecturer at the University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Michael, welcome back to TVP World. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you.
So it's all getting very complicated. Let's start with the meetings that are currently happening in Miami. What can you tell us about what you've heard about the progress there?
Well, I haven't heard anything about what I would call progress. I see these as more talks about Ukraine without Ukraine. You mentioned things getting more complicated. I think we should look at the agent that is complicating things, which is Russia, the aggressor, because Ukraine has made things very simple. They already agreed to a ceasefire early in the spring, and they've already agreed to direct talks with Putin, either in a bilateral or a trilateral format. And what we've seen since the spring is a succession of delaying tactics to complicate issues and make it seem as if there's a diplomatic effort. But what's really happening on the ground is the invasion is going full throttle and the bombing of civilians is unrelenting.
Well, I think many would agree with your analysis there, Michael, and I do want to come back to that. But first, I'd like to explore. Yes, I mean you mentioned Ukraine isn't involved in the talks in Miami, but there was some suggestion that the European representatives would be. That doesn't seem to have happened. Now there are talks of President Zelensky was talking about having trilateral conversations with Russia, Ukraine and the US involved. Is that going to make a difference, do you think?
It might make a difference because President Zelensky has the task of trying to keep the American alliance with Russia from solidifying completely. And Russia's effort to isolate Ukraine and to separate Europe away from matters of European security, it's really up to President Zelensky to show leadership and forestall that. And that's why he has to present a counter-proposal for a peace plan in conjunction with European leaders. That's how he's the one who has to constantly want to bring in European diplomats. But it's very difficult because the Russians have already succeeded in getting their choices on the American side. There are no American diplomats. There are no representatives of the State Department. There are just these friends and confidants of Trump there, who Trump himself said that Witkoff knows nothing about Russia. And so we see something else is going on. I think President Zelensky is in a very difficult spot, but he's done very well to avoid the worst outcome, which is the United States committing completely to its alliance with Russia, withdrawing from NATO, removing sanctions unilaterally, all these things that Putin wants.
Right. Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said twice now in press conferences that it is not America's intention to make the decisions on behalf of either Russia or Ukraine, but simply to identify the art of the possible, what compromises are acceptable to both. Do you think America is actually placing pressure on President Zelensky to, for example, compromise on land?
Yes, they are, because we see they're putting no pressure on Russia to stop occupying land that they've invaded and occupied. Don't forget that the war has actually been going on for coming up to 12 years. The territories we're talking about, Luhansk and Donetsk region, were first occupied in 2014. The Russians have not completely occupied either one of those regions up to now. And don't forget that Crimea was occupied in 2014, and that has been removed from the discussion by the Russians and the Americans. So I see no pressure being put on Russia by the Americans, and all the pressure on the Ukrainians to capitulate. Don't forget that Secretary of State Rubio has always, as other American officials has, always presented this in a both sides way. There is fighting, stop the killing. At no point has been there this official recognition that Russia is the aggressor and Ukraine is the defender, and that both sidisms in fact favors the aggressor, which is what the Americans are doing.
Indeed. Now, this call that Putin has made, put through to Macron, and which has been received favourably by Macron, that the two should have a conversation. What's that all about?
It's about divide and conquer strategy that Russia has against Europe. We've seen this debacle of the European Union failing to dedicate seized funds from the Russian aggressors towards either Ukraine's defense or Ukraine's reconstruction. And this consolation prize of a loan, which is underwritten entirely by European Union. So Russia is off the hook here. And rather surprisingly, although Germany was very committed to European security at the talks in recent days, France fell away from this consensus of the major powers and sided with these countries that had been already compromised by Russia, Belgium, Hungary, and Slovakia, and to some extent Italy as well. So what we see here is Putin giving his reward to Macron, to being an all talk, no action kind of leader, which is the kind that Putin prefers. I mean, he can have European leaders say things and talk about their solidarity with Ukraine and condemning Russian aggression all day long as they don't do anything about it. And France has been in the back of the pack in that respect, in terms of actually doing anything to stop Russian aggression or aid Ukraine's defense.
So it seems as though he's muddying the water and weakening links across Europe and between Europe and the United States. Where does all of that leave President Zelensky?
It leaves President Zelensky, first of all, as the de facto leader of Europe, because he's actually in a strong position, because he's the commander-in-chief of the largest effective fighting army against the Russian aggressors. He has the support of his people in that Ukrainians are not going to submit, and it effectively makes him the leader of Europe. And so Putin's mission is to, at all costs, stop that recognition that Ukraine leads by action, and go back to this idea that talk, empty talk, such as Putin might have with Macron, is in fact the real narrative. Whereas, again, it's a distraction from what's really going on, the invasion, which has been going on, bombing and shelling by the Russians every day for coming up to 12 years.
How are things being read on the streets in Ukraine?
Very discouraged. a strong turn away from the United States, which Ukraine had been one of the strongest supporters, recognizing the weight of American support, in particular under President Biden. So there is a decided shift away from this and a recognition that this will not change for some time to come. I was reading today strong condemnation of President Macron and begrudging praise for Chancellor Merz at the same time for the kind of leadership he showed in these talks about the Russian assets and also the commitment of money. Don't forget there are quiet supporters of Ukraine, like Norway, which today pledged the largest amount of any country for Ukraine, this quiet support. So Ukrainians, you ask what they feel in the street, as determined as they ever are, but don't forget they're in mourning every night. They have to look at their compatriots who are killed by drones and missiles and recover. And they know they're in for one of the hardest winters of the war, but it doesn't mean they're anywhere close to capitulation. It's just not a possibility that enters into the Ukrainian consciousness.
Right. Now just a practical issue. You mentioned winter, and it's going to be a tough one in Ukraine because of the destruction of the electricity infrastructure. How well are people generally, especially, I suppose, in the big cities, but also in the towns, the smaller towns, are dealing with this? Are they managing to get the electricity up and running again fairly quickly, or are they resigned to other sources of heat?
Well, they've done this before. It's just particularly hard at the moment. What we have is rotating blackouts. And so in a city, there might be, say, 2 or 3 hours of electricity a day. But it's scheduled and people know ahead of time and they plan for that. So they charge up things, do their cooking, anything that needs electricity. That is a coping strategy that the government is very open. It's not some accidental thing. And also now, because Russia bombed the bridge between Ukraine and Romania, in addition to this, there is a fuel problem. This could be alleviated by European allies stepping up. It could have been alleviated by releasing the frozen funds to Ukraine. But Russians are coping, and it's very difficult. But they're not chopping down the forests and burning them down for heat and that kind of thing. You mentioned rural areas, and they will endure.
Indeed, I'm sure they will. Michael MacKay, thank you so much for laying all of that out for our audience. Have a good evening, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though, lots more coming up. Bye for now.